right. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. I know people are still joining, but we are really excited today to talk about materiality assessments with Point B. My name is Allison Reeser. I am the Director of Sustainability and Innovation here at the Pet Sustainability Coalition. And before we get into it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about PSC in case you are new to what we're up to. If you'll go to the next slide. So PSC is a nonprofit, and we are here to help the pet industry drive positive impact for both the environments and the communities where we do business. We've been around for over 10 years at this point. You can click to the next slide. And here are just some of the ways that we support the industry. So the whole concept is that one company can't fix these big problems on their own. So we're trying to move together as a coalition, and we focus on ingredients, packaging, and social responsibility. So if you are interested in learning more, of course, reach out to us. But you can go to the next slide. We are, of course, here today for a webinar. Today's webinar is about materiality assessments. I'm so excited to get into this. It's kind of a buzzword, but also just a really critical part of a sustainability strategy. But I wanted to let you know about some of our upcoming webinars. On September 12th, we're doing one about our enhanced member benefits. PSC has evolved some of what we are offering to the pet industry to make it even more valuable. So we're going to deconstruct what that looks like. And then on September 12th, we're hosting a panel about innovative protein sources. So definitely don't miss that one. A quick plug, we do have sponsorships available for these webinars, so reach out to us if you're interested. And then, of course, a big shout out today, both our sponsor and our presenter is Point B, and we're lucky to have Ana Barrera here with us to talk more about it. One quick housekeeping thing before I turn the microphone over to Ana. If you have questions, we will have time for Q&A at the end, but please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, not the chat feature, if you want to ask a question, and we will make sure we get to as many as we can. But just a quick introduction, Point B is one of our preferred project partners at PSC. We've done some really exciting work together, and I've had the pleasure to work with Ana before on a few projects. So I think that's it for the PSC introduction, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Ana.
Thank you, Allison. Really appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. As Allison mentioned, my name is Ana Barrera. I'm a Sustainability Solutions Director here at Point B. I spent about 10 years in the corporate sustainability and ESG space with an emphasis on ESG reporting and disclosure strategy, program management, and ESG ratings management. I also consider myself somewhat of an ESG materiality nerd, so I really appreciate PSC hosting me today to discuss materiality assessments with you all. Before we dive into today's topic, I just wanted to provide a quick overview of who Point B is. We are a mid-sized management consulting firm with about 700 consultants nationally. While I support our sustainability and ESG practice specifically, which works across industries, we have several other capability areas, including digital and tech transformation, operations and supply chain, strategic execution, among others. We believe, and I think our Net Promoter Score backs this up, the fact that our customer experience really sets us apart from other consulting firms. So we're really proud about the fact that our clients tend to stick with us year over year. And while we're here today to discuss materiality assessments specifically, often this marks a relatively early milestone in a corporate sustainability journey. Our sustainability and ESG practice serves organizations at this earliest stage of sustainability work, but we also serve some of the most mature companies in the Fortune 100 to progress their ESG strategies as well. Our work spans both ESG reporting and climate action. On the reporting side, we support materiality and maturity assessments, ESG strategy, and ESG and sustainability report development, design, and publication. And then on the climate action side, we calculate GHG inventories, develop decarbonization roadmaps, support science-based target setting, and lead climate-specific annual reporting like CDP and TCFD. And we often bring together our sustainability expertise with other capability areas across the firm, like org effectiveness, data and analytics, and other areas to really best support our clients in working through their specific business challenges. Our team has been working in the sustainability space for decades when this was a very nascent area, even for the largest companies. And we're proud to work with our clients across industries and various maturities to set and achieve their ESG goals. So what are we going to cover today? I want to start off by talking about the purpose behind conducting a materiality assessment and defining some really key terms that will be kind of recurring in our conversation. Then we'll go into some detail around the steps you'll typically see to complete a materiality assessment if you're going to engage a third-party partner or consultant. And finally, we'll discuss the typical outputs of a materiality assessment and the steps that might follow its completion. Then we'll have some time at the end to address any questions that you might have. So let's kick off today's discussion by talking about what an ESG materiality assessment is and its purpose. Really, what is an assessment meant to achieve? All ESG materiality assessments are intended to identify environmental, social, and governance topics that are critical to your stakeholders. Think about stakeholders really broadly here, including employees, customers, investors, suppliers, and even the communities that you operate in. The assessment is also intended to identify ESG topics that are most important to your business strategy and financial health, so that you can prioritize those specific topics and measure progress against them. And third, the materiality assessment should identify significant positive or negative impacts caused intentionally or not by your company. Typically, there's heavy overlap between the significant impacts caused by your company and those that are critical to your stakeholders and business strategy, but not always. As I mentioned earlier, companies often begin their ESG journey with a materiality assessment so that they can identify the ESG issues that matter most to their business and stakeholders. This is a means of setting and focusing your ESG strategy. It's also not typically a one-time exercise. Materiality assessments are usually conducted every 2 to 4 years to make sure that your organization is continuing to focus your resources and disclosures on the most relevant ESG topics, even when your business is changing and growing. So many times, a significant business event like a merger or acquisition or entry into a new market might trigger a materiality assessment because you would expect perhaps your material topics to shift. It's also important to note that ESG topics surface through a materiality assessment really vary widely by sector, industry, company size, maturity, geography, and a host of other factors. So even companies in the same pet health and wellness space would be expected to have even slightly different material topics depending on where they operate, where they are in the value chain, their environmental impacts relevant to their products and services or other factors. Here's a sample of 27 material topics for a mid-cap hospitality company. This is a representative list of topics that might come out of a materiality assessment. You'll typically see topics categorized by environmental, social, and governance pillars, but not necessarily in equal numbers like this. And that's okay and even expected to have those like kind of lopsided results with more topics falling in one of these 3 pillars or categories than the others. Also, even though the topics are categorized by these 3 pillars, there's often social implications of environmental and governance topics and vice versa. And there's not a hard and fast rule about the number of topics that should be surfaced in a materiality assessment, but we typically see somewhere between 15 and 30 topics that come out of the assessment. Smaller companies, especially those outside of high risk sectors, tend to have far fewer material topics. And that reflects maybe less ESG risk compared to much larger companies with a more sprawling or complex operational footprint. And smaller companies tend to not have the level of resourcing to focus strategically on dozens of topics and will end up consolidating material topics into broader areas of work that they can start to chip away at. Looking at these example topics, you may already be doing some deep work in a few of these representative areas, particularly under the governance and social pillars where many companies start their ESG journey. You should expect that you're already addressing many or even most of your material topics that would come out of a materiality assessment. And that's because materiality assessments are not really intended to cover or uncover new areas of work. It's really to affirm what's important again to your stakeholders in business and help you organize your internal ESG or sustainability strategy and external communications around those topics. So it's really rare to be what I would consider to be surprised by the results of a materiality assessment if your organization is already in regular communication with its stakeholders. So Allison, I know that PSC has put some thought into the material topics most relevant to its members. Anything that you would add there?
Yeah, thanks for letting me pop back in on this topic. Yeah, we have definitely coached some of our members in the pet product industry through this process, and it can be a little bit intimidating, we've found, to take this like rather large list of potential topics and be able to narrow that down into the ones that are most relevant to their business, like you've been talking about, Anna. So I'm going to drop in the chat right now a resource that we put together to kind of jumpstart this process. Again, it shouldn't replace a thorough review of what matters most, but what we did is we took the list of about 100 potential topics and subtopics that come out of the CSRD requirements in Europe, and we took a critical look on it, compared it to some other frameworks and just our experience in the pet industry, and we narrowed that down to about 30, I think maybe 50 topics that we think that companies in the pet industry could consider first. So just wanted to share that this is a resource and PSC can support with this from an industry perspective.
Awesome. Such a great place to start. Thanks, Allison.
Yeah, thank you.
So why bother going through a formal process of conducting an ESG materiality assessment? There's a few pretty good reasons. One, materiality assessments are increasingly an expectation set by ESG global reporting standards and more recently of regulations coming out of the EU, which is affecting global companies. And as a result of those expectations, materiality assessments are becoming fairly standard practice for at least mid and large cap companies. Materiality assessments also help you focus your efforts and messaging on issues that are most important to your stakeholders in business. So it avoids you having to guess what investors or customers or other stakeholders want you to invest in and disclose around your sustainability work. It forms the basis or foundation of your internal ESG strategy and external sustainability or CSR reporting. In conducting a materiality assessment also surfaces business risks and opportunities. ESG materiality assessments can and should help inform your enterprise risk function by identifying and helping to monitor risks with significant financial implications to your company that fall within each of those material topics. So there's a progression here of ESG becoming more of a risk function and having these materiality assessments inform or at least cross-check your internal risk register. Without turning this webinar into a regulatory update, I do think it's worth mentioning one piece of legislation that is transforming corporate ESG and sustainability practice as we speak. And Allison just referred to it. That's CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is now required by EU law. So starting next year, 50,000 companies, including 10,000 non-EU companies, will begin disclosing information on sustainability practices at a really unprecedented level of breadth and depth. This is by far the most comprehensive ESG regulation that we've seen globally to date. Many of you are probably thinking, I don't operate in the EU. This doesn't really affect my organization. But we believe that in a few short years, we anticipate that this regulation is going to entirely shift market practice globally because so many companies are affected by the regulation. It's not just specific to companies that are based in the EU, it's companies operating in the EU as well, which means that tens of thousands of more companies will be affected. And then it's going to have this ripple effect well beyond those companies that are directly subject to the law. And among the CSRD's requirements is a double materiality assessment. So we will touch on that in more detail in this next slide. I want to get into the nitty-gritty, some of the semantics here. What is a double materiality assessment and how does it compare with a single materiality assessment? When we discuss single materiality, or what we might consider a regular materiality assessment, we're typically talking about financial materiality, or in other words, ESG topics that materially influence a company's cash flows, development, performance, position, cost of capital, or access to finance. So for example, deforestation may be a financially material issue for pet food companies that source beef from countries with a high risk of deforestation related to cattle farms, like Brazil. There's the financial implication related to compliance to maintain these suppliers amid new global supply chain traceability regulations, but there's also potential financial implications tied to headline or reputational risk associated with deforestation if your company does have a compliance breach from one of its suppliers. So any materiality assessment you undertake will be evaluating the current and potential impact of ESG topics, environmental, social, and governance topics, on your company's financial health. We assess financial topics by evaluating the likelihood of these risks occurring and the potential magnitude of the financial effects if it did occur. So let's kind of take the magnitude, that term, and kind of double click on it. Magnitude of financial effects can be extrapolated by fines if you were to violate certain rules, laws, regulations. We also look at financial losses associated with similar risks experienced in the past. We look at drops in share price from similar reputational events experienced by peers and a number of other methods. It's important to note here that the magnitude of financial impact is always kind of an estimated range. That's really specifically tailored to your company size. So you can imagine that a moderate financial impact for a small company is going to correspond to a really different dollar value than a moderate impact of a large company. One more note on ESG financial materiality. So this is kind of especially a note to my regulatory and compliance friends. Historically, ESG single materiality and financial materiality, as defined by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, were quite distinct. So in the past, ESG materiality emphasized the importance of each topic to stakeholders, and not really necessarily the financial implications of those topics. The goal, even a few years ago, of materiality assessments was to better understand what issues influence stakeholder perceptions and decisions about the company. And those kind of were considered well beyond investor perceptions, including employee perceptions, community perceptions, et cetera. But this has really evolved in the last few years. While the definition of ESG financial materiality is not quite the same as the SEC's definition of financial materiality yet, that SEC definition is really tied to information that a reasonable investor would deem important to their decision making. There is growing convergence around these definitions. The SEC has signaled that some ESG issues should be considered financially material. With regulators kind of moving in this direction globally, we expect large companies to move more towards integrated financial reporting, which combines financial and ESG information, representing a much more holistic view of how both financial and non-financial factors influence business performance and strategy. So that is a good segue into double materiality. Now, when we refer to double materiality assessments, we are evaluating the financial materiality of ESG topics, but we're also evaluating these topics by what's called an impact lens. Impact materiality assesses your company's positive and negative impacts on people or the environment. And these impacts may be the direct effects of your company's products and services on people or the environment, or they may take place up or down the value chain, but there's still impacts ascribed to your organization. So another example is helpful here. If your products contain non-sustainably sourced seafood, the company may be negatively impacting marine ecosystems. Depending on the scale of the issue, this could be considered a material negative impact on the environment from an impact materiality lens. You can probably imagine that many topics that are material from an environmental and people perspective might also have financially material implications. These impacts are evaluated independently of each other. We look at financial materiality and impact materiality separately, but there tends to be a lot of overlap. The topics and impacts that are material from an impact perspective are often also financially material. So that is double materiality in a nutshell. We see many more companies now than ever before requesting double materiality assessments. And that's a really direct result of the EU CSRD regulation that we just discussed. But it's also kind of an indication of a natural progression of sustainability work. But for smaller companies or companies just starting out on their materiality assessment process, single materiality assessments are still by far more prevalent and a great launch point versus double materiality assessments. So hopefully we now have a firm grounding in what a materiality assessment hopes to accomplish. So I want to pivot here and talk about what this process typically looks like. The 4 steps I'm about to outline generally apply to most materiality assessments conducted by third-party consultants. And that's because they're largely informed by global standards and shaped by emerging regulations. What I mean by this is that there is more and more guidance being put out by ESG standard makers and regulators over the last couple of years around how this process should be conducted, which has informed a more standardized approach across consulting partners. The steps I'll cover here correspond to a single materiality assessment, that being a financial materiality assessment, but this process can easily be adapted to accommodate a double materiality assessment. So those 4 steps are: 1, assessment design, which requires the third-party partner to conduct background research on the company to be able to tailor the assessment process to your specific business context. The second step is a topic inventory, or building a list of potentially material topics and related impacts. The third step is to engage stakeholders on each topic and impact and to score their input. And finally, the last step is to validate and report the results. Let's cover each of these 4 steps in more detail, starting with assessment design. So in the first step, assessment design phase, the goal is to detail your business context and value chain as a means of tailoring the stakeholder engagement plan for the assessment, and to begin to populate the topic inventory, which I'll get to in the next step. This is done by detailing your business model, including your organization's activities, structure, and regulatory environment. as well as your value chain. We detail your business relationships up and downstream. So think about your suppliers and distributors. This upfront work helps your materiality partner or consultant identify your primary stakeholder groups. Groups both impacting and impacted by your organization. In an ideal materiality assessment, all of these stakeholder groups would be engaged at some juncture in the process. Some stakeholder groups might be tapped to inform ESG risks and opportunities. So think about your board of directors, NGOs, investors. These groups can help identify potential ESG risks and opportunities based on their specific knowledge of the organization and their sector expertise. Other stakeholder groups might be better positioned to assess the likelihood or severity of a very specific risk or set of risks. Those stakeholder groups might include your employees, academia or researchers outside of the company, and company leadership. So, for example, retail employees will not be experts in all potentially material ESG topics, but they will have unique insights into your company's workforce diversity risks, labor practices, health and safety risks, and probably a few others. So those would be a few of the topic areas that we might cover in an employee survey as part of this, the next engagement step. Alternatively, we might consult an NGO with expertise in sustainable seafood practices to better understand the company's marine ecosystem risks and, of course, the financial implication of those ecosystem risks. So this background research helps us to start thinking through your primary stakeholder groups that should be engaged at different steps in the assessment process. And it also starts to surface those ESG risks and opportunities that may be material for your company based on your specific operating context and value chain. So the second step here is to build out your topic inventory, the goal of which is to identify potentially material topics and related financial impacts through structured research and targeted engagement. We started to document those topics and related impacts, including risks and opportunities, in the prior step, but here we fully flesh them out during this phase. A topic inventory usually takes the form of an Excel workbook or document that captures all of the potential topics and related impacts that could be material to your company. When I use the word topic, I'm talking about the broad ESG category. So think back to those 27 sample topics that I showed earlier, like human rights, waste diversion, and others. But when I use the term impact, I'm talking about the actual implication to or by your company that would fall under that topic. So for example, under the topic of human rights, a financially material human rights impact might be sourcing cocoa butter from West African areas known to be at high risk for using forced labor, which would expose the company to significant reputational risks that could negatively impact its financial position via consumer demand. The inventory of topics and their related impacts is typically constructed by pulling together research from a multitude of sources. Those might include your ESG legal requirements, ESG standards and frameworks, internal grievance mechanisms, employee and supplier surveys, peer analysis, media scans, ESG ratings, and I could go on and on. There's a host of other sources that we typically include in or consult in building out the inventory. The number of initial topics in the inventory can exceed 60 or more. I've seen over 100 topics in an inventory for large companies, but these are typically consolidated down to 20 to 50 by combining similar topics and focusing on those that are most prevalent across those referenced sources. These 20 to 40 potential topics in the inventory are then validated with internal stakeholders as those most likely to be material to the company based on underlying financial implications. And when we validate those, it usually looks like a presentation to an internal cross-functional working group where we go through the topics and kind of justify the ones that made that 20 to 40 list. And sometimes there's some disaggregation or aggregation of topics depending on how they're related and how material they're considered to be or potentially be for the company. The third step is to take the potentially material topics and impacts identified through the inventory exercise and evaluate their materiality by engaging the stakeholder groups we identified in the first step. Stakeholder engagement is usually done through a combination of surveys, interviews, and focus groups, with the objective of assessing the severity and likelihood of each financial impact and translating that into a score so that we can compare the relative materiality of impacts across different topics. If you're familiar with risk scales, many partners will use a form of a risk scale or adapt your company's risk scale to quantify stakeholder input on each impact. Once you've completed engagement with your stakeholders, including subject matter experts across topics, a materiality threshold is typically applied, where all topics that have financial impacts above that significance threshold, usually a number that falls above an insignificant level of materiality, all of those that fall above that level are considered material, and all of those that fall below are considered financially immaterial. Typically, within a single topic, if one impact is deemed financially material, it means that the overarching topic is material to the business. So thinking back to that cocoa butter example, if sourcing West African cocoa butter exposes the company to material financial risks associated with forced labor, then the topic of human rights, the topic level, would be considered financially material to the company. The last step is to validate the results of the materiality assessment with your company's leadership to confirm the findings. At this juncture, there's occasionally justifiable changes to the topic scoring. So for example, we've seen some topics just have relatively light stakeholder engagement because we were unable to source an internal subject matter expert if it's a particularly technical topic. Or sometimes a topic that has regulatory implications from our desk research was deemed immaterial through internal stakeholder consultation. These issues might warrant us adjusting the topic scoring to more accurately reflect the financial risk to the company. And that's done through a really collaborative approach through consultation with company leadership. But in the end, it's important that the company leadership sign off on the results of the assessment, particularly the list of material topics and their relative prioritization. These are then translated into an internal report detailing the approach, findings, and analysis. The report is also typically accompanied by a materiality matrix, which charts your material topics by importance to stakeholders and impact to business value, which is just another way of saying financial materiality. That's if it's a single materiality assessment. In the case of a double materiality assessment, the matrix typically charts topics by both financial implications and the topic's impact on society. And while all topics on the materiality matrix are typically considered at least somewhat material, those that fall in the upper right quadrant are usually considered to be most critical to address, as they represent the intersection of greatest financial and stakeholder importance if it's a single materiality assessment. Or in the case of a double materiality assessment, it represents topics that are both highly material from an impact and financial lens. So that's the process you'll typically see if you engage an outside partner to conduct a materiality assessment. Just to underscore the outputs of a typical assessment process, you'll usually get the results of your stakeholder engagement from your partner. That includes survey results and topics that are segmented by the stakeholder group that you engaged. So it's really often helpful for our clients to see what their customers prioritize from an ESG standpoint versus their employees or investors so that they can better tailor their ESG messaging to these distinct audiences down the road. You'll also likely receive a materiality report, as we discussed. The report typically includes the approach to the assessments, and this is increasingly expected of standard makers to disclose as well. So, for example, the Global Reporting Initiative and SASB increasingly are looking for materiality processes to be disclosed with topic definitions and related financial material impacts. And you'll also get that materiality matrix that we discussed, a visual summary of the findings. And you can often see that materiality matrix in a company's external sustainability report. So you've completed your materiality assessment. Now what? We recommend that companies summarize the results of the assessments internally. For employees, companies often share the material topics that came out of the assessment and reiterate a commitment to make progress on these as part of the overarching business strategy and purpose. But it's also really good practice to socialize the more detailed results at the impact level with the functional leaders responsible for overseeing those areas of the business. Beyond sharing out the results, the material topics should be prioritized in your overarching sustainability strategy and disclosures. So if you're early in your sustainability journey, it's often helpful to map your material topics to the existing oversight, strategies, programs, and metrics that are aligned to each to be able to identify areas of strength and opportunities of improvement. The identified gaps in this mapping exercise can then be translated into near-term action items for functional leaders responsible for each of those areas. If you're kind of more mature or further along in your sustainability journey and already have strategies in place for managing all of your ESG material issues, then you might use the materiality assessment as an opportunity to make sure that there are KPIs established for each material impact surfaced in the assessment, and that there are governance mechanisms in place for monitoring the business's performance across those KPIs over time. Your organization might also consider externally disclosing your material topics and matrix. Your material topics should form the foundation and structure of any CSR, sustainability, or ESG report that you publish and are required to meet GRI standards. GRI, or as I mentioned, the Global Reporting Initiative, puts out a widely used set of standards for publishing sustainability reports. And then, as a reminder, I know I mentioned this up front, but materiality assessments are not typically a one-time exercise. For companies, particularly companies that undertake external sustainability reporting, they typically refresh their materiality assessments every few years to make sure that they continue to be focused on the right issues. So I know we've covered a lot of material today, so I'm going to wrap there and turn it back to Allison.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna. I think one of my favorite things that you said that like clicked something in my brain was about how we should consider the groups that are impacting and impacted by our business. I think that was like a really great way of describing it. Like, yeah, like a company exists in a system and is impacting and impacted by things all the time. So yeah, thank you so much. Little round of applause. So we do have a few questions in the chat. So for attendees, feel free to use that feature to drop more in. One of my questions that I wanted to start with was about what are some of the pros and cons of working with a third party to do materiality versus doing it internally?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think in general, if you are a mid to large cap company, particularly if you're public, it's largely considered best practice to engage a third party to conduct the materiality assessments. And that's just from, purely to bring in an objective voice and expert to facilitate that process. And so I think that's kind of where we see a lot of outreach happening across our clients to make sure that they have somebody who's well versed in the process to undertake it, especially as it becomes more structured and formalized under different standards and regulations. We have seen some of our smaller clients do what we consider a rapid materiality assessment in-house. Sometimes that's a great way to kick off the exercise and start to prepare their internal stakeholders for a more formal process down the road. So there's no quote unquote wrong way to approach this, particularly if you're not public and there aren't risks in terms of disclosure and how you're conducting the materiality assessments. But certainly having an objective kind of third party voice kind of facilitate the approach is preferred, especially as those results will be increasingly verified by auditors with newer regulations.
Awesome. Um, there's actually, so I want to slide in here and mention that PSC has developed a materiality kind of pared down version that relies on a survey. So if that is something that meets people's needs, we've kind of created a lighter version of it, which actually a question in the chat tees up a perfect evaluation of that. Someone is asking that focus groups and interviews seem to be the biggest budget impact of doing a materiality assessment. So would a survey alone that is sent to key stakeholders be adequate for reporting requirements like CSRD? And so on top of that, just like an eval, like what how good is a survey and how helpful is a survey alone in this process?
Yeah, well, I can take that in two separate parts. Could you conduct a materiality assessment using or relying on purely survey results? And the answer is it has been done. Yes. Would I consider it best practice? Probably not. And is it adequate for CSRD? The answer would be no there. And that's because CSRD requires subject matter expert consultation across all topics and impacts to assess the magnitude and likelihood of all of those different risks and opportunities. And so a survey generally won't get to the level of granular detail required to justify the results of that assessment. However, if you're, again, a smaller company early in your sustainability journey and just starting to undertake a materiality assessment or interested in doing it in-house, then I think relying on survey information from your employees, suppliers, even your investors and customers is a fine place to start.
Awesome. So something for everyone, depending on what level you need. Great. PSC for our materiality offer, we are adding in those layers of subject matter expertise. So I'm actually right now going to drop a bunch of links in the chat just for people to peruse through while we're doing the Q&A. If you are interested in working with PSC and or Point B on your materiality, please reach out. We would love to support you with those. And so yeah, the emails are in the chat and then you can see them on the screen as well. So I'm coming to another question that we have received. We were getting a lot of good questions, so thank you everyone for doing that. So we have one here. So because double materiality involves financial materiality, is financial assurance required by CSRD? And if yes, who do you see typically leading a double materiality process internally? Someone like the CFO?
Great. I love this set of questions. So CSRD does require assurance for the results of the assessments and the CSRD report more broadly. And we typically see your big four auditors conducting that assurance process. There's typically, I know the big four does conduct materiality assessments as well, but obviously there's far more players in that space with sustainability expertise that I would recommend be kind of considered as your key partners in undertaking that kind of third party or consultation role. As far as your internal leader, sustainability responsibilities are kind of run the gamut in terms of which roles they are typically folded under. We've worked with treasurers, the CFO, we've worked with CSOs, we've worked with controllers and compliance increasingly because of the regulatory movement. But there's no kind of recommended lead per se. However, we do recommend putting together a working group of cross-functional leaders that represent kind of the key areas of expected materiality. And that's to help kind of validate different steps of the process. I mentioned validating the initial inventory early on, and then at the back end, validating the results. So those are two critical junctures where you need different voices at the table familiar with the different topics at hand and require just different expertise across the business. But there are other junctures that we would love to include some expertise as well in the process. And so the short answer is that we see the responsibility to lead the exercise falling in a multitude of different roles. But what's arguably more important is that we get that kind of executive level working group together to help kind of make sure we have full coverage across the different topic areas as we work through the results of the assessment and make sure that we land those topics and impacts accurately at the end of the day.
Awesome. So it's assembling your team is a critical part of it. A quick follow-up on that. So you mentioned about having subject matter expertise and that sometimes that comes internally and sometimes that comes externally. How do you know when you have the right number of subject matter experts involved and when you maybe need to tap someone externally?
Yeah, there's no right number of subject matter experts. It's about breadth and depth of coverage. So, for example, if it's a topic on deforestation and we are looking for some specific information about the level of ecosystem and financial risk. Oftentimes, the business is internal stakeholders are really great at providing enough information to specify the financial and business risk to the company, but perhaps not as versed in the ecosystem impacts of those risks of the business risks. And so having that external perspective is often helpful to assess the likelihood and severity of the impact lens of things. We also tend to evaluate as we go through kind of subject matter experts available to us, their relative expertise in the area that they're evaluating. And we typically rate that on a level of 1 to 5 together with the business leaders that we're working with. And so and in order to enable us to understand the risks of the results. So if there are material topics where we only have 1 or 2 stakeholders weighing in with a relatively low level of expertise on those topics, that's where we would go ahead and recommend that we pull in more established external voices to help supplement those interviews in order to get a more accurate outcome.
Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about the timeline it takes to get this done. Someone is asking in the chat if a small to mid-sized company has never done a materiality assessment before, how much time is it going to take them to complete? to gather all the information. And in this case, if they're working with the consultant. I'm also curious to just kind of expand on that question and ask, like, also if you're a big company, or like, what are the other factors that impact the timeline?
Yeah, broadly speaking, materiality assessments take anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And that's extremely variable depending on the breadth and depth, whether it's a single or double materiality assessment. What we like to operate in is in the 4 to 6 month range if it's possible. Have we done it in less? Absolutely. But it's definitely an all hands on deck exercise, because the piece that takes the longest amount of time is the engagement. So depending on how difficult it is to get the surveys, particularly customer surveys, employee surveys, approved internally and pushed out, that can lead to some longer or pushed out timelines. Depending the number of interviews conducted, if it's 25 or more, those can take some time to schedule. And so the timeline is really contingent on the level of engagement expected. The simplest single materiality assessment certainly could be conducted within a few months. But if we're looking at kind of CSRD compliant double materiality assessment, it's more of a 5 to 6 month timeline, with the level of intensity of the engagement and just being able to calendar all of those interviews and make sure that we have the right leadership at the table at those approval stages. We want to make sure that there's a level of rigor in assessing the results and making sure that all of the scoring is appropriate. In general, you know, materiality assessments are often and should not be a box checking exercise. It should be a pivotal part of you establishing your ESG and sustainability strategy. And so, to the extent that you can use it as a mechanism to get internal stakeholder engagement and excitement around the strategy, that you can get buy in and accountability of the functional leaders to own the areas of sustainability, then you're giving additional mileage to the exercise. And so certain pieces shouldn't be rushed in order to get adequate buy-in and to get, I think, the most impact out of the assessment in general.
Yep. Good things take time, as always.
And yeah.
There's a question here that maybe I'll address, and Anna, you can jump in if you have anything to add. But the word assessment gets thrown out a lot in sustainability. We're assessing a lot of different things. So someone asked how a materiality assessment compares to a certified B assessment. So just to clarify, certified B Corp is kind of a label that you get. So there is certainly an assessment element of something like that. And if you meet a certain threshold, then you're able to say you're a certified B Corp. There are a ton of different assessments that lead to a certification, but materiality assessment is different in that it's more of an internal process. It's really about information gathering that you need for both disclosure for various requirements and also strategy setting. So there's not any sort of like label that you get to stamp officially on your company after going through a materiality assessment. Do you want to add anything to that, Anna?
I think it's a great take on it. Personally, I don't love the word assessment for this exercise. I wish it was labeled more of a process, because an assessment often, I think, conjures like a thought that you're going to get a grade at the end of it. And that's not the intent. It's to get kind of the foundational pieces of your strategy going. So I think you nailed it, Allison. It's not that you're getting a score or a certification or something at the end of this process. It's like, you're kind of building the foundation of your strategy. And so it's more of a process than what I would consider what we think of when we think of an assessment or a test or something that we're going to get results in how we're doing at the end of the day, because it's not about that. It's really just kind of a reflection of your stakeholder point of views and your business risks.
Totally. The questions are still coming. I love it. We have a few minutes left, so I think we can get to quite a bit of them. We talked a little bit about the CSRD, so that is regulation in Europe. Someone is asking about maybe something happening in the United States more, perhaps the SEC, will they start requiring it? Do you have any insight about like what are going to be the next requirements that we're going to have to pay attention to?
Yeah, well, I'm sure some folks on the line are heavily attuned to the SEC proposed, well, final climate rule that's currently being litigated and is currently stayed. That climate rule does not include a materiality, a ESG formal materiality assessment as part of the language. It does, however, include the inclusion and disclosure of climate related financial risks and financial filings. So there is an element of sustainability materiality that's specified in that regulation. There's no current or proposed regulation that is proposing to require ESG materiality assessments in the US. However, I do, and this kind of goes back to CSRD, I do think that market practice is largely going to be shifted because of the requirement out of the EU. And there's just going to be, I think, an effort to keep up with your peers that have global operations. Often when something like this happens, there's a few years where everybody's kind of playing catch up to try to match disclosure. And I think we are kind of moving towards a more integrated financial and ESG reporting model over the next decade or so. And that may be slower for US based companies that don't have international operations, but I think eventually practice is going to shift in that direction.
Awesome. I'm glad that you have the regulatory expertise to be able to speak to all of this too. I really appreciate it.
I
Okay.
am not a lawyer. I do not give official legal advice. That's my disclaimer there.
Yes.
But in general, it's important that we be, as our space is being more heavily regulated now more than ever, it's important that all of us kind of stay abreast of ESG regulations globally so that we can help inform our customers and advise them on the best ways to tackle some of these areas where maybe they're not directly affected, but certainly their peers are.
Yep. Yep. Okay, I don't want to ignore the folks in the chat asking about budgeting and cost. We have at least two questions about that, and I think a project like this is definitely custom scoped, and the cost is going to range a lot. But Anna, maybe I'll reframe the question and ask about just like what tips do you have for folks who want to get this into their budget for the coming year or so?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And you nailed it, Allison. There's so many variables that it really, the range is quite large. A materiality, double materiality assessment for a global company looks entirely different than a small private company. And so I just want to kind of set expectations there. There's no kind of one price fits all here. I think it is helpful to think through what the level of engagement with your stakeholder looks like for you as you if you do want to pursue a materiality assessment. We can always advise on what best practice looks like, but if you know that there's kind of limited capacity in terms of engaging dozens of internal stakeholders, that maybe you don't want to reach out to your financial external stakeholders, then we'd be looking at maybe a dozen or so interviews. Maybe you do one survey instead of three. So some of those questions to start to think about it, because it'll help the scoping and the pricing conversation kind of dial in on what your needs are. But typically in terms of a resourcing perspective, that we have at least two stakeholders that are dedicated to the project, that are helping to shepherd each of those four steps through to the finish line, that are helping to advise and build out all of the pieces that we discussed, the topic inventory, doing that background research. So there's a lot of hand holding that takes place. Now, the caveat is that if the team, your team, or our clients want to be more heavily involved, then it tends to be a lighter lift on our side. Say that there's experience with materiality assessments from the client or customer, that it will also impact pricing. So those are some of the variables that will shape the end pricing estimate, but just know that it's widely variable and really dependent on the depth of engagement, the speed of the assessment, and so on.
Awesome. Well, just like that, we are at the end of the webinar. If I didn't get to your question, feel free to follow up with us. You have our email addresses on screen and in the chat, so I'm happy to answer any lingering questions. Also, of course, if people want to talk more about doing materiality, PSE and Point B work closely together, so reach out to either of us and we will connect you to the right resources. I also dropped in the chat some of the Point B publications about materiality, so if you want further reading, check those out. I know we're right at time, but Anna, do you have any final comments?
No, I think we've covered a lot today. I want to thank PSC for hosting us and all of you for joining. And if you have additional questions, would love to have a conversation with you all. So don't hesitate to reach out, LinkedIn me, and hope to continue the conversation.
So thank you so much, Anna, and thank you so much everyone for attending. That's a wrap. Bye, everybody.
Bye.